Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Pannill Camp today. Pannill Camp is Associate Professor in the Performing Arts Department at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches theater history and theory, dramatic literature, and performance theory. His research focuses on exchanges between theater, architecture, and philosophy in 18th century France, French Freemasonry as a set of performance practices. Now, Professor Pannill Camp, of course, takes into account the historical and philosophical context of Masonry, but from what I understand, what is really essential here and what is really original for today is the fact that he really considers the Masonic ritual for itself, and he examines, the signs that Masonic ritual induces initiates to think. Actually, he thinks that the Masonic ritual is a method of philosophical inquiry in itself. All right, but I'm not going to speak for him. I'll just add that he actually wrote several articles, one on the pantheisticon, May Philosophy Flourish, Pantheisticon, Freemasonry, and 18th century ritual philosophy, which I really found very interesting and which he might make available to you if you so wish, of course. And he actually wrote also a seminal book, which is The First Frame, Theatre Space in Enlightenment France, which was published at Cambridge University Press in 2014, and which received an honorable mention for the Association for Theatre in Higher Education and the outstanding for the 2015 Kensho Prize. Also, he actually is now at work on two new book projects that explore the social dimensions of performance in the modern era. One entitled Arts of Brotherhood, French Freemasonry in Performance, and the other one entitled Performance and Social Theory, which traces theatrical ideas in social theory from Montesquieu and Adam Smith to the mid-20th century sociology of Irving Goffman. So really, I think we are all looking forward to listening to Professor Pannill Camp. So please, Professor Pannill Camp, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Révauger. I'm truly honored to be introduced by someone whose work I have admired so much. And one of the joys of presenting today to this group is the chance to be able to meet you via Zoom. So this talk is really derived from an article that I published in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies late last year. And I had been at work on this for a few years. I presented an early version of it at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And at that time, I was very fortunate to have an audience of academics and Freemasons in attendance. I'm not myself a Freemason, and for that reason, I'm always very glad to share my research with Masons when I can. So I would also like to thank this group for the opportunity to get some feedback on this aspect of my research. As you'll see, and as Cécile has indicated, it has to do with ritual itself, something which I only know through texts that I can find in public archives and Masonic archives, and which I don't know firsthand. So the majority of the talk that I'll give momentarily is a summary of a historically grounded theoretical argument about the meaning and function of Masonic ritual. But I would like to take some time at the beginning to share a narrative of how I arrived at this topic, and that I think will also illuminate some of the background and perspective I bring to my research on Freemasonry. So I am a theater historian by training, and I initially encountered Freemasonry in the course of writing my book, which is a history of French Enlightenment theater architecture reform. One central figure in that book, an architect named Claude Nicolas Ledoux, a visionary reform-minded architect who was active in the last decades of the 18th century in France, was a Mason. And that aspect of his background helped me understand some of the more esoteric aspects of his writing. So when I finished that project, I began to look more into Enlightenment era Freemasonry. When I was doing my reading on Freemasonry in the 18th century, I noticed that many influential works of social and cultural history made the move of identifying Freemasonry in the 18th century with new modes of sociability. And there are several books and authors that do this. I'm thinking now of Roger Chartier's Cultural Origins of the French Revolution, Dina Goodman's Republic of Letters, and there are several other titles in which the sort of takeaway is that Freemasonry was one of several social developments that cultivated new practices of association that were called sociability, right? And in these works, sociability is invariably identified with one or another emergent modern condition. So new modern institutions, Republican forms of government, civil society are argued to have some roots or precursors in forms of democratic sociability or cosmopolitan sociability, of which Freemasonry is seen as a sort of institutional driver. So often the historical basis of this way of describing the social life of Freemasonry is studies of lodge organizations, the way that leaders are elected, observations about the way men in the lodges were able to bracket their status as commoners or aristocrats or members of one or another religion and meet within the lodge on equal ground. So one thing that stood out to me about these studies, and I think this is because of my training in theater and performance, was that these historians usually sort of ignored the rituals almost entirely. And this was curious to me, not just because of my training in theater and performance studies, we are very interested in ritual, but also because from my reading, it was clear that ritual activity was considered essential to Freemasonry, that it was identified as in some sources as the sort of defining craft and purpose of participation in the Brotherhood. So I have been interested in developing a greater historical and theoretical understanding of Masonic ritual, in part because there are some very interesting points of connection between theater history and Freemasonry. At this point, I'm going to share my screen so that I can let you look at some images. There you go. So there's some very interesting points of connection between theater history and Freemasonry. I've written a bit in other articles about Masonic plays. In France in the 18th century, there were at least half a dozen plays for the public about Freemasonry. Many of them are sort of satirical or poking fun at different things that Masons did or were known to do for profane audiences. Some, like this play, Les Freemasons Hyperdrame. It was a drama that took a very sympathetic view of Masons and tried to sort of explain the purpose and the sort of moral quality of Masons for a non-Masonic audience. Pierre Clement is a fascinating figure. He belonged, we believe, to the same lodge as Montesquieu, the Loge Louis d'Argent. And he also is known to have produced the first French translation of an English play called The London Merchant, written in 1730. And that play, I believe, and other scholars believe, is actually quite infused with Masonic teaching. I don't want to go on and on about this, but this is a fascinating point in theater history, because The London Merchant and its reception, translation, and study in 18th century France by people including Diderot is seen as an important moment in the emergence of modern drama. Mm-hmm. And the play is quite Masonic in its themes, and may have been produced with the support of Masons in London. And there are other fascinating bits of theatrical history that intersect with Masonry. There's a fascinating figure named François Félix Nogaret. He was a personal librarian to the Comtesse d'Artois before the Revolution. In his activities before the Revolution, he wrote Masonic poems and short pieces of literature, including some short plays, which were probably read for court audiences in the 1780s. During the Revolution, he, in 1795, switched sides and became theater censor in France for a time, starting in 1795 as well. But besides Masonic plays, there's an undeniably theatrical aspect, I believe, to Masonic ritual to consider. This image, some of you may have seen, is from a published malicious exposure of the Masons in the 1740s for French audiences that purported to expose the secret activities and the rituals that Masons were up to. And from this exposure, from all of the many ritual documents, catechisms, descriptions of rituals that are available today, it's easy to see that there are aspects of theatrical practice in Masonic rituals: scripted dialogue, role play, the management of space, light, costume. All of these indicate a high level of theatrical sophistication in Masonic ritual. And as I've written about in other venues, this theatricality was sometimes self-conscious. The American actor Edwin Booth, great American tragic star in the 19th century, wrote that, and he was a Mason, wrote that the legend of Hiram was the most sublime tragedy in his repertoire. So in today's presentation, rather than talk about the intersection between theater history and Freemasonry, I'd like to look at the significance of the ritual itself, and in particular, the question of whether and to what extent Masonic ritual can be understood as a kind of philosophical practice. This is a question that comes out of my academic field, theater and performance studies. Scholars, including Diana Taylor and Rebecca Schneider, have argued that the coded repetitive behaviors that we call performance, which includes theater and ritual, amount to a mode of knowledge transmission. So apart from the written and propositional knowledge that can be stored in libraries and archives, we use our bodies to learn, to understand, to instruct others. So it's common in dance and martial arts and sports to think of knowledge that is something that can be transmitted from body to body. And this category of embodied knowledge is thought to be extensive. So there's a growing subfield in theater and performance studies known as performance philosophy, where scholars claim that the horizon of embodied knowledge goes well beyond the acquisition and transmission of these kinds of physical skills, and that actually there's an underappreciated realm of human knowledge and philosophy whose basis is performance. So it's in this context that I would like to examine historical Masonic ritual performance as a potential category of philosophical inquiry. And I'd like to do that within the specific historical frame of the 18th century. This allows the theoretical question, what is the relationship between performance and philosophy, to be examined through specific historical terrain, where both philosophical and ritual activities were unusually abundant. So in the first decades of the 18th century, Freemasonry flourished and lodges multiplied in Britain initially, before continental outposts appeared in the Netherlands and in France. Freemasonry therefore traced the same paths through Europe as did Newtonian natural philosophy. And of course, we now think of this as physics or natural science, but in the 18th century, there was a different understanding of philosophy, and what we now think of as natural science was considered a category of philosophical knowledge. So Freemasonry traveled from Britain to the continent along with Newtonian natural philosophy. And this is understood as one of the major forerunners of the 18th century explosion in secular thought that we now call the Enlightenment. The coincident proliferation of Masonry and this important current of Enlightenment philosophy has prompted historians, including Margaret Jacob, to posit that Masonry and the Enlightenment were tightly linked. So Margaret Jacob presses a strong case that Freemasonry was actually a vector of transmission for ideas that challenged existing political orders and mindsets. One component of this claim is that as a newly constructed and growing social network, Freemasonry etched new channels of privileged communication across geographical, national, and social boundaries, and thus provided a vehicle for transmission of Enlightenment thought. And that phrase, vehicle of transmission, is one of Jacob's terms. So Jacob also contends that the social practices within the lodges promoted specific philosophical ideas in at least two ways. For one, the Masonry's political impact on the 18th century on Jacob's interpretation was partly a function of both the civic notions of belonging that Masons held and concrete organizational practices. Masonic lodges were, for Jacob, microscopic civil polities, new public spaces, in effect, schools for constitutional government. For another, Masonic activities bore some intrinsic connection with the philosophical content that they promulgated. This is, again, one of Jacob's claims that I will challenge soon. So Freemasonry on this interpretation amounted to the institutionalization of Newton's mechanical conception of the natural world. Jacob's assessment of the philosophical dispositions of Masonry is based on her extensive research into freethinkers and political radicals in the Netherlands during the wake of England's Glorious Revolution at the end of the 1680s. She argues that Freemasonry was responsible for the spread of Newtonian ideas outside Britain in the early 18th century, and that tenets of the moderate Newtonian worldview accord with the belief structure intrinsic to Freemasonry. British Freemasonry thus carried out, quote, the institutionalization of the Newtonian creed, and, quote, the mentality of official Masonry, i.e. its taste for science, its craving for order and stability, and above all, its religious devotion to higher powers, helped disseminate that creed. So I'll just pause to note that the way Jacob interprets the relationship between Freemasonry and philosophy is to say that she believes Freemasonry, in the way it was practiced in the minds of Masons, was intrinsically related to specific ideological or specific philosophical ideas. So while mainstream Freemasonry began to spread deistic Newtonianism and constitutional monarchism throughout the intellectual centers of Europe and beyond, according to Jacob, more radical elements of the Whig Party after the Glorious Revolution and continuing through the wake of the Hanoverian succession in 1714 subscribed to a more extreme Republican ideal. Exponents of this political ideology found in the Netherlands an active publishing industry and a group of French Protestants with their own subversive motivations. Integral to Jacob's view of the legacy of these radical sectaries of the English Revolution is the ideological pairing of two sets of ideas. On the one hand, a moderate and in the long run mainstream vein of Enlightenment thought that combined a deistic version of Newtonian mechanism with a concomitant support for constitutional monarchy. So Jacob sees those two sets of ideas, Newtonian mechanism and constitutional monarchism, as being corollary and sort of intrinsically linked as well. Distinct from this ideological composite, more radical thinkers proposed that no force outside of nature itself came to bear upon material existence. This materialist or pantheist creed carried political corollaries, Jacob claims, including republican principles of government and, crucially, the need for a civic religion based on the premise that mankind was part of one thoroughgoing material natural order. So again, to be clear, beyond what Jacob would argue is the sort of mainstream and more moderate reformist set of ideas, there is this more radical idea of materialism and pantheism and republicanism, which, you know, in the 21st century, perhaps we don't see republican governmental structures as being particularly radical. They were, of course, quite radical in the early 18th century. Jacob concludes that Freemasonry served as a vehicle not only for the moderate, progressive, scientific, and political ideas that flourished after the Glorious Revolution, but also for the experimental sciences. By the early 18th century, British Freemasonry gave institutional expression to this new scientific culture. This was a matter not only of administration, but also of ritual content. Jacob considers the radical proto-Masonry carried out in the Netherlands at the turn of the century to be, quote, the ritual expression, unquote, of a new religion of nature that rejected Christian metaphysics. And that phrasing, that formulation, the idea that the rituals she finds in the Netherlands were expressing a specific philosophical idea is something that I will examine. So there are compelling reasons to doubt Jacob's account of the meaning of the coincidence of Masonic practice and radical philosophy. The notion of an intrinsic sympathy between Freemasonry and the Newtonian ideological complex Jacob identifies can also be called into question. Even in its earliest modern incarnation, the Brotherhood welcomed members with sometimes sharply opposed political views. Like English lodges, moreover, the first lodges in France included both Gallican lodges headed by English exiles with Jacobite or Catholic sympathies, and Anglican ones with Protestant leadership. In the decades of high enlightenment in France, philosophes, including Diderot, and anti-philosophes, including Élie Catherine Fréron, were counted among Masonic ranks. So Freemasonry's apparent hospitality to opposing religious and political views to some extent undermines the notion that it could have served as the institutional expression of any specific set of beliefs. And here, the historian Reinhard Koselleck's contrasting interpretation of the Masonic phenomenon is illuminating. Koselleck acknowledges that Masonic lodges did at times promulgate Republican political ideals and other tenets of Enlightenment philosophy, but he maintains that the relationship between any particular thought tradition, religious belief, or political commitment and the content of Masonic lodge activity was arbitrary. This is demonstrated not only by the fact that Masonic society included members of mutually antagonistic political, religious, and intellectual factions, but also by the diversity of ritual catechisms and degrees across systems. To quote Koselleck, the essential provisions of the Masonic mystery, the actual content of the secret work varied considerably, depending on doctrinal views, unquote. The meaning of the inward activity of the lodges, the mystery or arcanum in Koselleck's terms, isn't in correspondence to any particular set of philosophical discourse, but rather in the ritual effectuation of a separation of society's moral sphere from that of politics. And that's just a gloss of Koselleck's argument about what happens to political institutions and public morality in the 18th century in general. But the point that I want to emphasize is that he believes that the social function of Freemasonry was what was significant in the 18th century, as opposed to its affiliation with any particular set of ideas. So on this view, it would be a mistake to attempt to locate discrete philosophical beliefs in the content of Masonic rituals. To quote Cécile again, the mystery had different contents in different systems, but always the same social function. So as an aside, I think this is a persuasive view, but I wouldn't want to hit it too hard. In other words, it's not the case from my understanding that, say, in 18th century France, Masonic lodges had a huge variety overall of predominant religious commitments or political points of views. Kenneth Loisel's recent book, Brotherly Love, which is about French Freemasonry and friendship in the 18th century. In that book, he categorizes the sort of religious views that you can affiliate with lodges to a kind of ecumenical Christianity, which is to say it was somewhat of a welcoming place for people who had a Christian worldview, but was, inclined to de-accentuate differences in specific denominations or specific commitments. So there's obviously, I believe, some variety, and also depending on the location of where the Masonry is practiced, some commonality among what could be found in those lodges. But there's another set of challenges to Jacob's position that can be found in contemporary ritual theory. These theories undermine the very notion that ritual practice can serve as a vehicle for philosophical views understood as pre-existing propositions. Stanley Tambaya, for example, argues that because the form and content of ritual are necessarily fused, any analysis of ritual content requires a proper analysis of ritual form. And I'm going to put up here a slide that just has a nice summary definition of ritual given by Stanley Tambaya. I'll note that this is not specific to Freemasonry. This is from Tambaya's general writings on ritual. So I'll read along with you. Ritual is a culturally constructed system of symbolic communication. It is constituted of patterned and ordered sequences of words and acts, often expressed in multiple media, whose content and arrangement are characterized in varying degree by formality or conventionality, stereotypy or rigidity, condensation or fusion, and redundancy or repetition. Ritual action in its constitutive features is performative in these three senses. In the Austinian sense of performative, wherein saying something is also doing something as a conventional act. In the quite different sense of a staged performance that uses multiple media by which the participants experience the event intensively. And in the sense of indexical values, I derive this concept from Peirce, being attached to and inferred by actors during the performance. So on this interpretation or understanding of ritual, rituals include sequential structures, organizing logic, participant sensory experiences that don't necessarily translate into propositions, into statements that you could put into a linguistic form. They don't draw participants into a particular belief system, nor express preformed beliefs. Rituals rather produce new bonds among participants, perpetuate certain attitudes, and articulate particular cosmological or ideological constructs in the bodies and the material objects that are in the spatiotemporal present. So I would note here that one can still use Tambaya's interpretation or definition of ritual to argue that Masonic rituals have an underlying ideological or philosophical content, but to my knowledge, the type of formal analysis that he would say is necessary to decipher that content is missing in Jacob's study and in others who would identify Masonry with a constitutional monarchy or Newtonianism, et cetera. And the point here is just that Tambaya would say, he obviously implies that there can be a kind of content or a proper worldview that is intrinsic to a ritual, but that to decipher it, you have to sort of pick it apart and look at the form of the ritual and understand what that intrinsic connection is. Catherine Bell, another important theorist of ritual, furthermore, rejects the notion that ritual behavior expresses prior conceptual entities at all. She notes that this view, which is deeply woven into 20th century cultural anthropology, rests upon an analogy of ritual with drama. Ritual performances are seen as depicting or modeling a preconceived worldview, an ethical code, or a value system, which it is the observer's job to extract. And now, as Bell explains, this analogy formalizes the presumption that rituals exist to be seen by outside observers, like a play with an audience, and is rooted in the participant-observer dichotomy that scholars, particularly anthropologists, bring to their objects, rather than anything inherent to ritual behavior itself. So again, to sort of reiterate this, Bell's point is that because a lot of cultural anthropology was grew out of Western scholars visiting cultures to which they were outsiders and witness, and these researchers would witness rituals and interpret them along the lines of drama because they were outsiders viewing the rituals in the way that a theater audience might view a spectacle on stage. But Bell argues that this was a fallacy, right? Because the rituals were not created or practiced for outside audience members. The participants in the ritual were both the participants and the audience for the event. And so it was a mistake, she argues, to sort of see it as a kind of drama that has an interior message to it. Furthermore, the notion that ritual expresses or serves as a vehicle for pre-existing ideas unduly dichotomizes, for Bell, thinking and acting. Bell's critique of the dramatism to which early performance theories of ritual were susceptible readily applies to Jacob's characterization of the relationship between Masonry and Enlightenment philosophy, but that doesn't mean that Masonry cannot be understood in the context of the history of philosophy. It simply means that the activity at the core of Masonic craft should be approached as a ritual performance with cognizance of ritual's unique features. So, having sketched out the historical case for identifying Masonic ritual with specific currents in Enlightenment philosophy, and some of the objections that can be raised from historians and theorists of ritual, I would like to turn to constructing an alternative interpretation of the relationship between Masonic ritual and philosophy. And I'd like to do that in part by examining sources that Jacob herself situates in the history of European Freemasonry. In her book, The Radical Enlightenment, Jacob argues that radical Protestantism from England directly infused Masonic activities in the Netherlands. Central to this claim are the documents of a secret organization in The Hague that met around 1710. Jacob identifies a set of thinkers with Republican and materialist views and identifies them as members of a clandestine organization known as the Knights of Jubilation, which she considers to be Masonic. On this basis, she interprets John Toland's 1720 publication Pantheisticon as a Masonic ritual that sprang from the radical underside of Freemasonry in the Netherlands. So I want to pause here and just say that Jacob, in her book and in her writing about Pantheisticon, calls this a Masonic ritual. My understanding is that she means that it is essentially Masonic, that the society had a lot of attributes that proper Masonic lodges would have as well. From my reading and research, it bears little resemblance to what I would call properly Masonic traditions and rituals. And so I'm examining this because I accept Jacob's argument that perhaps this society in the early 18th century was in communication with people who traveled to France and later participated in Masonic lodges. I accept her argument that it bears a lot of sort of congruencies, similarities with the ways that Masons organized and congregated and conducted their lodge activities. But I don't believe that it is necessarily uncontroversially a properly Masonic text. But I just want to make clear that that's the context in which I'm examining it. So Toland's Pantheisticon helps illuminate the role that Masonic ritual played in the development of Enlightenment philosophy, not because, as Jacob concludes, it was a Masonic ritual in a strict sense, but because it overtly mobilizes participants to philosophical activity. The ritual part of the volume, the quote, form of celebrating the Socratic society, is preceded by an essay on the nature of learned societies and the pantheist understanding of the universe, and followed by a discourse on pantheist virtues and the dualistic presentation of the sect's beliefs. So for outsiders and for the society itself. There's a section of this which that I'm not going to read, which deals with the sort of esoterica, which was information belonging to members of the secret society, and the exoterica, the way that the society presented itself to outsiders, which I think is a significant way of understanding one of the points that I'll make later. Even though it's difficult to assess how widely Pantheisticon was put into ritual practice, the text shows that Toland believed that philosophy could take the form of ritual, its ritual attributes, orchestrated embodied activity, symbolic and self-reflexive communication, formality, manifold performativity, all offer a framework for understanding 18th century Masonic ritual as a type of philosophical activity. The aspects of this ritual that best illustrate its relationship to philosophy and that may prove most useful for a broader theory of ritual performance as a philosophical activity can be grouped under two headings: action and distinction. And so these concepts are important to the way that I want to argue ritual can be understood as a kind of mode of philosophical inquiry: action and distinction. The ritual philosophy of the 18th century marshaled the resources and techniques of performance to spur participants to concentrated, open-ended philosophical thinking. Philosophy in this performative situation seems to have been understood by its participants as a coordinated, embodied activity. This activity, however, depended on the utmost secrecy, which was predicated on a strict conceptual distinction between the inner world of the brotherhood and the profane world outside. While Masonic secrecy certainly served to defend the organization against persecution and helped generate an air of mystery that drew in new members, it should also be understood as an outgrowth of the self-referential, differentiating tendency that marks ritual behavior in general, and a condition for generating and preserving knowledge through containment. So I will reiterate this point, which I think that the sense of differentiation, of distinguishing what is inside and proper to the society versus what is outside and proper to the everyday world and the profane world, is very important to the way we can understand ritual as a philosophical activity. Compared with what I would call proper Masonic rites that were practiced in the 18th century, Toland's ritual is quite minimal, whereas proper Masonic rituals are rich with symbols, action, and performative operations. Pantheisticon is very spare, but it does impel its participants to action, and it is begun with a classical performative speech act. The president speaks, and this is just a quote from Pantheisticon itself. The president speaks, "May all happiness await our meeting." The rest answer, "We institute a Socratic society." President, "May philosophy flourish." This is the way the ritual, the form of celebrating the society, begins. While Pantheisticon is light on the sorts of symbolic actions one finds in Masonic rituals, there are many indications in the text that the ritual induced its participants to actively think, to collectively reflect on metaphysics and natural philosophy. The structure of the book mimics a path of initiation into the Socratic society. The preface confronts the reader with a gesture of separation to prevent infiltration by credulity and, quote, "the dull infatuation of being led by the examples of others," unquote. The pantheists must separate themselves from the multitude. Near the end of the introductory essay, Toland suggests that the philosophy of the pantheists depends upon cultivating an inner circle among whom no discord arises, and who are alone privy to the internal or pure and genuine philosophy. The society is described gathering around a modest banquet, at whose conclusion, quote, the waiters and servants, as so many profane and illiterate persons, are shut out and the doors closely bolted, unquote. These measures are presented not as precautions to guard the secrets of the society, but to protect the social unit that makes the pure philosophy of pantheism possible. Much of the philosophy named in Pantheisticon is recited, including a philosophical canon, which is part of the second part of the ritual. But the ritual elaborated in the text does not just recite propositions. It is not just readings of Cicero and Horace, which subordinates action to philosophy in discursive form. Toland explains that the members of the society, quote, frequently interpret this canon and deduce from it the most abstruse theorems of natural philosophy. This activity is orchestrated. Quote, at stated times, they ruminate on the law of nature, unquote. Philosophical actions are also inscribed in the ritual itself. The centerpiece of the ritual sequence appears in the second part, entitled The Deity and Philosophy of the Society, unquote. The president orders that the group, quote, keep off the profane people, unquote. The group then sings a hymn in unison, and then several readings from Cicero are heard before the recital of a list of the names of 9 sacred philosophers. The central moment of the second movement, and thus of Pantheisticon as a whole, is the reading of an extended section of Cicero's De Natura Deorum. Immediately before this is read, an exchange between the president and the group suggests that the ritual is meant to prompt active thought. The president says, now, dearly beloved brethren, the philosophical canon is to be distinctly read. It must be weighed attentively and must stand the test of your judgment. The group responds, as the contemplation of the nature of things is agreeable, so also is it a most useful science. By attention, therefore, we shall weigh and judge. I think it is probably clear from the text, but what's significant here to me is that it's made overt that this is not just a sort of empty formal recitation of language, but that those present are meant to be attentive and to use judgment and to weigh what they're hearing. So that thought is encouraged, thought is being induced. As with the words heard at the opening of Pantheisticon, may philosophy flourish, this exchange might be meant to guide the society in contexts outside the performance of the ritual. But this would not rule out the possibility that the ritual is designed to instance philosophical attention, reflection, and judgment in the course of its own performance. Considered along with the many active verbs that command concentrated thought, interpret, deduce, ruminate, weigh, judge, the phrase may philosophy flourish seems to be directed at the ritual activity that follows. Besides its function of orchestrating the embodied action of thinking, Pantheisticon exhibits another quality that was critical to producing and promulgating Enlightenment thought. It reiterated the distinctions between the inside and outside of the community of thinkers it brought into being. Like Freemasonry more broadly, Pantheisticon accomplished a separation of inside and outside through continual self-reference by asserting again and again the difference between its own members and others. This function of distinction amounts to another critical component of ritual philosophy. It performed the containment of specialized knowledge. In this way, Pantheisticon does one of the things that Victor Turner and Catherine Bell, those theorists of ritual, have argued is essential to the function of ritual, to differentiate what belongs to the ritual from what belongs to everyday reality. Intrinsic to ritualization, Bell writes, are strategies for differentiating itself from other ways of acting within any particular culture, unquote. These include the marking of ritual activity as a way of acting that specifically establishes a privileged contrast, differentiating itself as more important or powerful. Toland overtly deploys such strategies. Pantheisticon simultaneously signals that its practitioners are different from and superior to the uninitiated. The boundary that defines the society is figured architecturally. Quote, "The coast is clear, the doors are shut, all's safe," unquote. A set of verses denigrate the profane masses outside the closed meeting. Quote, "That we may also laugh to scorn the bugbears of silly people," unquote. So I don't want to take too much time, but in concluding, I'd like to point out that the same two concepts, action and distinction, that I'm using to argue Pantheisticon can be interpreted as a ritual that enacts open-ended philosophical reflection, can also be applied to what I would call proper Masonic rituals. And here I will just be making references to a handful of Masonic ritual texts from the 18th century, catechisms and reception manuscripts. Some of these are identified with Scottish Rite, and some with what I would call blue lodges, regular 3-degree rites practiced in Masonic lodges in the 18th century. The right to attain the degree of apprentice asks the candidate to distinguish between operative Masons, maçons de pratique, and speculative Masons, maçons de théorie. As a self-described theoretical pursuit, Freemasonry, which by the 18th century was almost completely speculative or theoretical, aligned itself with abstract thinking, gesturing toward the speculative philosophical modes that dominated 17th century rationalism. In the artifacts of rituals, there are signs also that initiates were expected to concentrate their minds on profound questions. The apprentice rite that opened the gate to the brotherhood commenced with isolation in a dark room that was sustained for sometimes up to 2 hours. A ritual manual from 1775 explains that after a brief interview, a candidate has all the metal taken from his person, his right knee exposed, his left shoe untied, he's blindfolded, and then, quote, abandoned to his reflections for about an hour in a darkened chamber. These reflection chambers or obscure chambers are commonly understood to commence a psychological ordeal. And this is an interpretation I'm taking from Kenneth Loisel, and that the ordeal separates the individual, inducing fear or disorientation that ultimately bonds the new Mason to his adoptive brothers. But the reflection called for in the ritual manual also bears philosophical connotations, and is part of a theme of intellectual searching that runs through the lodge cycle. In the catechism that concludes the apprentice rite, candidates are asked to recount their initiation. They testify that they searched for the light. The narrative of enlightenment is reinforced by an exchange that soon follows, and which demonstrates the importance of mystery and symbol to the Mason's moral and philosophical journey. This is an image with a bit of translation from that 1775 catechism. Question: what did you see when you entered the lodge? Response: nothing that the human mind can understand. Question: what did you see when you were received as a Mason? Response: 3 great lights. Question: what did these 3 great lights signify? Response: the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge. Here, initiation is equated with expanded comprehension of the vast symbolic edifice of Masonic craft. The attainment of each degree reveals pieces of the organizational structure, oblique clues about the arcane symbolic matrix of the lodge, and elements of the central tragic myth that is finally revealed in the rite of master. At every step, the ascending Mason is prompted to meditate on the meanings of symbols that promise to transcend moral philosophy and tap the profundities of metaphysics. So the work of the Masonic Lodge was no less dependent upon self-referential messages that distinguished the order from its surrounding environment. So now I'm on to the distinction part. The early rites are largely concerned with separating the candidate for initiation from the profane world. As Loisel has reported, some rites of apprentice included a skull placed in the reflecting chamber to signify the death of the profane self. The separation of Masonic society and knowledge from a profane and sometimes malicious outside world was held up not only by oaths of secrecy, but also through instruments of secrecy such as the Masonic cipher alphabet and other secret codes. And perhaps the Masons in the audience will know of other sort of instruments for maintaining secrecy and differentiating between inside and outside. So in conclusion, I'd like to return to the question that framed my research here. What is the relationship between ritual and philosophy? I believe that Freemasonry attracted initiates who bore a variety of ideological and religious commitments, but in practice, it fostered concentrated and somewhat open-ended philosophical thinking. It also distinguished itself from what it considered a vulgar and unenlightened society. Masonic ritual philosophy was active and embodied, self-differentiating, and capable of articulating views of both material and moral reality, both of which it presented as improvable. Such a framework might lead to a holistic assessment of Freemasonry's significance in the intellectual and social landscape of 18th century France. But beyond this historical consideration, the features of Freemasonry offer enticing suggestions to performance studies scholars and to the theory of ritual in general. The twin implicit Masonic imperatives of action and distinction to promote active thinking and to continually assert the difference between that way of thinking and quotidian ways of thinking suggests that performance activity has long been not only another way of knowing, but also a device that assiduously distinguishes those who know and from those who don't, and which can suggest that performance itself may be understood as a generative containment of knowledge. That is my presentation, and I would be very happy to have questions and responses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Pannill. Now, can you all hear me? Because I tried to switch the video on again just to be polite, but tell me if you can't hear me, right? Okay. So I think this was a really very thought-provoking talk, and of course I'm right. I read Margaret Jacob extensively, as you did. So quite honestly, I think that in fact your two approaches are rather complementary. In fact, right? I do not see any real opposition. Because, as you say, I mean, you really think that 18th century Freemasonry is linked to the Enlightenment. This is something that you do not deny at all. And but I think what you insist upon, of course, I was really interested in your approach to Toland. And I would totally agree with you that Pantheisticon is not a Masonic ritual as such, right? I totally agree with you. But of course, when we speak of the Knights of Jubilation, that's another story. And Rousset de Missy indeed was a Freemason and influenced French Freemasonry. Well, yes, you're right. It's not, Pantheisticon is not a Masonic text in itself. Yet, what I mean, I would like to ask you, I mean, it doesn't seem to me to be so focused on the ritual, in fact, because Pantheisticon, I mean, in Pantheisticon, the ritual is quite minimal, right? It's true that it encourages the members of the Socratic Society to think, but and to meditate but I mean, you could also sum it up by, well, let's eat and have fun now, you see? That's what, so, yeah. Right, but I think, but on the other hand, certainly, I mean, what I would insist, what struck me is that it is a pantheistic text. And this goes against the monotheism of the time. And indeed, I mean, in the first English lodges, I'm not sure that there were many pantheists. That's true, because there was an allegiance to monotheism, although of course, as you know, in Anderson's constitutions, everyone was free to have his own religion and not the religion of the state, which was something, well, really important. Right. Well, also, what I would like to ask you is, don't you think that what you are saying is absolutely convincing for 19th and 20th century Masonry, rather than for the 18th century in itself? Well, concerning the importance of the performance, the performance of ritual, because I think it's different. I mean, if you take English lodges, which, well, I have never visited, but from what I heard, I mean, indeed, the ritual is essential. And I mean, it is very theatrical, and that's absolutely true. And everything you're saying, action and distinction, seems to apply perfectly to English and American lodges, and especially lodges today. Whereas it doesn't apply so much to French lodges, because in French lodges, of course, there are talks and there is a lot of either philosophical or societal content, which is not the case in English and American lodges. And of course, but then we are discussing, of course, 1877, when there was really a rift between French and British lodges. And I know very well that this is not the period you're examining today. You're examining the Enlightenment. But you see, I mean, obviously, during the Enlightenment, French and English lodges and then American lodges worked in very, very similar ways. But what I'm wondering is whether the ritual was that important at the time. I think it became more and more important later on. And finally, just a tiny question and a real question. Have you found evidence of the existence of reflecting chambers in 18th century Freemasonry in France? Because I haven't, but I mean, I would be happy if you.
No, it's these are great comments, and I've made some notes, and let me respond to them severally. Quickly about your last question. I have not found that evidence. That's a claim that I'm taking from Loisel. And Loisel is one of the historians who really, I believe, tries to interpret the ritual, and he uses Victor Turner and uses ritual theory to try to interpret what the experience was for initiates in 18th century France. And he describes, he's read many ritual descriptions, and he describes these reflecting chambers. From what I understand, his claims are based in his reading of those manuscripts. I haven't found any, additional supporting evidence. And so, is the reflection a literal reflection? Are there mirrors present? It seems very plausible. It's a time when the manufacturing of mirrors was increasing and very popular, but the reflection could also be a sort of metaphor for intellectual activity. So I'm very glad you brought up the point about the relative importance of ritual in French versus English lodges, and later 19th and 20th century versus 18th century. And I will absolutely defer to your expertise, because I know of your extensive study of the minutes of the proceedings of lodges and how time was spent. But it's hard for me to believe that the rituals were not important. I mean, I know you're not claiming that. But it seems as though they were, even in France in the 18th century, considered a central activity. You can find lots of manuscript copies of the dialogues. There's all sorts of hints of the practice of them, right? Some of the catechism books were hand sized so that they could be held and kept in the pocket, and that suggests a disposition towards practice. The fact that the exposures of the 1730s and 40s targeted the ritual, and that so much was made of this activity, on the one hand suggests that this was something that was of a primary concern to Masons and non-Masons. What is going on in these rituals? Are they religious? Are they irreligious? Are they, what is this? But it could be that the exposures themselves distorted how significant the rituals are. And that, as you said, the social activity, the bonhomie, the sense of this is a protected space where we can come together without the intrusion of the state, without the intrusion of the church, I'm convinced, or I'm compelled by the interpretation that actually that was the point, and that the ritual activity was, perhaps, if you had, were able to interview men of the time, they would not say, oh, this is all about ritual, it's so important to me. But I think it merits research. And I think part of the reason why it's under-researched is that it's such a difficult project for the historian. You have all of these materials, but it is difficult to make a systematic study of the ritual documents that exist from so long ago. There's, a sort of tension between the way that certain elements are repeated in different lodges, and the sort of mystifying variety and informality of some of those documents. And of course, especially in the late 18th century, the sort of entrepreneurial creation of all sorts of different rites and divisions within the obediences, et cetera. But I think it's a very good point that this may be more applicable to later and other places where ritual is practiced. And I'll say this quickly to go sort of in reverse order to your comments about pantheisticon. Jacob herself does, she claims that this may be like Rosicrucianism. It may be more of a publishing phenomenon than an actual ritual that was practiced. When you read the portion of pantheisticon that describes the society, describes the sort of ritual or sort of performance-oriented portion of it, though, I think there are indications that it was meant to be practiced. There are indications that certain texts should be read at certain times of year, right? There's emphasis on these things that would make it practicable. And it's notoriously difficult to be certain about ephemeral behaviors and actions like performance of behavior. But when I read pantheisticon, I think this is something that maybe it was practiced, maybe it was done once or twice, but it seems to have been designed with the idea that this is something we can do to formalize our activities and orchestrate the way we're spending time and thinking together.
Absolutely, I think this is interesting. Of course, we'll take some questions. I just want to show you this book. Have you seen it? Probably, you're probably familiar with it. Albert, well,
no.
I thought it was published in 1927, and Albert Lantoine was a famous French historian of Freemasonry, and he actually found this fascinating French translation of Pantheisticon.
Oh, no, I don't know about that.
He says at the time there was only this translation. I haven't checked, but only that one. And it's a beautiful translation, I must admit. I generally hate reading translations, but Pantheisticon really sounds very nice when you read it in this translation. And of course, what he says is that, oh no, it wasn't Masonic, but it really influenced Freemasonry at the time.
Okay.
That's what he contends, actually. Right.
That's fantastic. I'll have to get my hands on that. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, so now let's take some questions. I think actually it's Oaken has the hand on the questions. Yes. I can't see any question.
We have no question for now, Cécile, but if there's somebody from the audience, probably maybe he or she could raise her hand. So
yes.
I would not want to step on anyone's questions, but I have questions for people who are listening and who are Masons, to the extent that they're comfortable speaking about it. With the historical specificity aside, to what extent do you find, or have you found, that ritual activity is something that prompts you to philosophical reflection? Does this sound like something that makes sense in your own experience? I would be curious to know if anyone has perspectives on that. I'm concerned with, 18th century and Enlightenment and textual sources, but not being a Mason myself, I can't refer to my own experience.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, someone's. Oh, David Cameron from Canada, right? From Quebec.
Yes, hello.
Wonderful. Hello.
I think I was really,
Professor Cameron, yes.
I was really struck by the idea of ritual performance transmitting embodied knowledge. We have two different rituals we use here. One is like emulation, and one is very much like the Preston Webb. And not to go into any details about either of them, but it seems that the Preston Webb one is far more kinesthetic in the way it's performed, as opposed to just standing there and talking. And that really fits with what you say about the embodied knowledge.
That's excellent. Thank you.
The other thing that I might just add is that I've never heard of mirrors in a chamber of reflection. I think it's the philosophical idea that they refer to.
Yeah, as you say, it's a pity we can't have Montesquieu come here and tell us about his experience.
Indeed.
I don't think he was too concerned with ritual, but you never know.
No. Well, and he's a point of evidence for Jacob's point about the affiliation with constitutional monarchism, you know, and embodiment of a certain moderate, restrained Newtonianism. That's very much his. I finished writing a chapter on Montesquieu for my social theory book, and that's very much where he was, and he of course was an early French initiate.
Yes, he was. Yes, in 1730, lodged the horn in London. Yes, yes. All right. Okay. So, any question maybe, or maybe someone who wants to react. Oh, there's a comment from Jussi Chivonen. I would say on my experiences on modern Masonic rituals, and I dare to say it was quite likely more or less the same in the 18th century as well, that the focal point is not so much on the actual content of the texts or meanings of the rituals, but on the feeling, atmosphere, and experience on the ritualistic event itself. Thus, I have never been so much worried of revealing rituals as reading them, is never the same thing as experiencing them. So that was an interesting comment by Jussi Chivonen. Sorry if I mispronounce your name.
I appreciate that. I'm reminded of the audience that I shared an early version of this for in Chicago, and this was mostly, it's a public library, and it was mostly academics in the audience, but members of a local lodge came and listened, and I think I addressed the same question to them, and the Mason who responded, you know, his reaction was similar in a way, which was that his experience had not been so much, this is philosophical contemplation, this is enlightenment, this is, you know, a sort of serious intellectual journey that I'm on, but that what was most meaningful to him was the connection with his brothers. He referred to having been in Vietnam as an American soldier and facing combat, and had very, you know, difficult experiences, and that at the lowest points of that experience, he felt a connection with his brothers around the world. And, you know, that's just one testimony and one person's point of view, but it does suggest that, you know, the social dimension of it, the sense of fellow feeling and commonality and brotherhood, and so much of what you read in 18th century sources is about amitié and this sort of cultivation of a certain way of feeling towards your fellow man, that was that remains.
Yes, but then
sort of
we are
primary aspect of the Masonic experience.
Yeah, but we are back to sociability then in the
Mm-hmm.
18th century. But of course, I suspect, of course, you must be familiar with that Netflix series, which is called Inside the Freemasons. Have you seen it?
No,
I strongly recommend it because it was sponsored by the United Grand Lodge of England.
So it's not a sort of History Channel,
but but I mean, it's interesting because it's just 5 episodes, totally sponsored by the United Grand Lodge of England, and they actually filmed, some extracts of rituals and some lodge meetings. This is why I'm recommending it.
That's
and then,
great.
Of course, it's purely a ritual performance, nothing else. And this is why I'm saying that, it's different, bro. I mean, in the 20th century, it's exactly what you're describing. Absolutely. But in Britain, not so in France. But in Britain it is, right? All right. But anyway, so I think yes, I mean, now OpenLFM suggests that we should perhaps put an end to this fascinating discussion, but unless there is another question or no. Okay, so perhaps a concluding word from you, Pannill.
Yes, well, I'll just conclude by thanking you all for taking time out of your Sunday evening or afternoon to listen. And if you have other questions or suggestions or reactions, I'm easy to find. I have a unique name, and you can find my email address online, and I'd be very happy to receive communication from you. And I'd like to thank Okan again for reaching out, and Cécile, thank you again for your responses and your introduction. It's been a very good experience for me.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. So bye-bye, everybody.